This is AMP1 lab, the first lab on terminology. Before we can start learning anatomical terms, we first have to imagine our patient or our person in anatomical position. A person that's standing in anatomical position is standing erect. They have their feet slightly apart. Their palms are facing forward. Their arms are down to their sides. Their thumbs are pointing away from the body, and the head is pointing forward. It's important to imagine our patient or our person in anatomical positions so that when we do comparisons of locations of body parts, we're all on the same page. For example, if my patient is standing up, the heart is superior to the diaphragm. But if my patient were lying down, the heart and the diaphragm would be on the same plane. So everyone, doctors, nurses, all of healthcare professionals, always imagine the patient in anatomical position. Once we've established that, then we can start looking at some directional terms and doing some comparisons of body parts. First two words we're going to look at are opposites. They are superior and inferior. Superior means towards the head, inferior means towards the feet. I could use those terms in comparing body parts. For example, my head compared to my shoulders. My head is superior to my shoulders, but my shoulders are inferior to my head. Looking at the stick man that is on your worksheet, what I'd like you to do is take your red colored pencil and draw a red arrow going towards the head. This will remind you that superior means towards the head. I'd also like you to take a green colored pencil and make a downward arrow so that you'll remember that inferior means towards the feet. If you kind of color over the word superior as you put it in that first blank, red, or you can write superior in red and then inferior in green, so that your eyes will go from the red superior word to the red arrow going up. This is a learning technique that even medical students use when they're learning anatomical terms. It helps to connect synapses in our brain and then helps us to exercise them later. So superior should be red and inferior should be green. Let's go to two other opposites. One means towards or at the front. That word is anterior. And then towards or at the back would be posterior. Now, in A&P, looking at the human, your anterior and your ventral surface are the same, whereas your posterior and dorsal surface are the same. Ventral really means belly, while dorsal means bony back. If we were looking at something like a dog, their ventral and anterior would not be the same. For where the dog's nose is, that would be his anterior, but then underneath his body where his belly would be, that would be ventral. Where his tail is, that would be posterior, his bony back would be dorsal. But he's standing on all fours while man is standing erect. So your belly and your front side are the same, anterior and ventral. Your posterior and dorsal are the same, your bony back. On your lab sheet, if you will write anterior ventral in yellow and posterior dorsal in blue, and then put the two little stars in front of and behind the little man, that way, that will remind you when you're studying that anterior is in front of, posterior is behind. Let's move to some other opposites. When we look at the human body, there's an imaginary line that goes right between the eyes, down the nose, and divides the body into equal halves. That's our midline. So if a body structure is closer to the midline, we call that medial. On your sheet, if you'll write medial in pink, away from the midline to the outside is considered lateral. If you on your lab sheet will write lateral in yellow or highlight it in yellow. So we can compare body parts. For example, your nose compared to your eyes. Your nose is more towards the midline where your eyes are towards the sides. So your nose is medial and your eye is lateral. Let's compare our eyes and our ears. Now our ears are lateral and our eyes are medial. But what if you wanted to compare your nose, your eyes, and your ears? We need another term, and that term is intermediate. On your sheet, if you'll write intermediate in green where it says between medial and lateral. Intermediate would be if I compare my nose, my eyes, and my ears. My nose is medial, my ears are lateral, and my eyes are in between, so they're intermediate. I have a picture of the hand there, and we're going to label it with medial, lateral, and intermediate. But before we do, I want you to think about that man in anatomical position. The thumbs are always pointed out, so the thumbs would be lateral. The little finger would be medial, and 3 fingers in between intermediate. So if you'll label that on your sheet, lateral, intermediate, and medial, and make sure you're using your colors yellow, green, and pink. Let's go to 2 more opposites. These 2 opposites, in order to use them, you have to have a point of origin. For example, where my arm attaches to my torso, my shoulder would be the origin of my arm. Or my leg attaches to my torso, my hip would be the origin. So now we're comparing parts and we're saying, are they closer to the origin or are they a further distance away? Structures that are closer to the origin are considered proximal, where those that are further distance away are considered distal. Let me compare my elbow and my wrist. My elbow is closer to the shoulder, so it's proximal. My wrist is a further distance away, so it would be distal. Let's look at our stick man. We're using the colors red and green. Red is going to be proximal, green will be distal. If we compare our elbow and our elbow would be proximal, our hand would be distal. If we compare our foot and our foot would be distal, our knee would be proximal. But what if we wanted to compare our shoulder and our elbow? Now our shoulder is closer to the origin, proximal, and our elbow is a further distance away, distal. How about our hip and our knee? Our hip would be proximal, our knee would be distal. Let's move to 2 more opposites, superficial and deep. If a structure is closer to the body surface, we say it's superficial. If it's further from the body surface, we say it's deep. Looking at this picture of the heart, that I have colored yellow would be superficial, it's closer to the surface, and that I have blue is deep. Let me give you another real-life comparison. If I compare my muscle to my muscle is superficial where my bone is deep. How about comparing my skin and my bones? Now my skin is superficial and my bone is deep, or my muscles are deep. So now that we've established some general directional areas of our body, let's divide our body into different planes or different sections. We can do that with imaginary lines. There are generally 4 of these planes or imaginary lines that divide our body into sections so we can look internally. Before we begin, we always have to establish on our picture or our specimen which is the right and the left. Looking at my stick man, I just wrote right and left. I need you to do that on your worksheet. If we take a sagittal plane will divide a body or a structure into equal right and left. So we call it mid-sagittal. If we take a sagittal plane and we just divide into left and right, we really don't care if they're equal, then we call that a parasagittal plane. So on your sheet, if you would write sagittal, half in blue and half in red, and then in parentheses where it says equal, put mid, and where it says unequal, put para. Now you know the difference between mid-sagittal and parasagittal. Mid-sagittal is equal right and lefts, where parasagittal is just right and left. We can also divide a body or an organ into its front and its back, or now we know more precisely anterior and posterior. A plane that divides a body into anterior and posterior is a frontal plane. And I have taken a yellow arrow and divided this man into his anterior and posterior. So on B of your worksheet, put the word frontal, color it yellow, and put a yellow arrow that divides along that frontal plane. Let's look at yet another plane. We could divide a body or an organ into its upper and lower parts, or superior and inferior parts. We're going to use a green color, and we're going to make a transverse plane. We're going to go across the body. We really could go anywhere. I chose right about at the hip region, and I made an arrow going across. If you think about a small case T, you make the first line straight up and down, and then you cross your T. So you can think about a transverse plane as crossing the T. So it goes across, dividing into superior and inferior. There is one more plane. Sometimes we don't want to divide a body or an organ along the perpendicular or parallel planes, but we want to go at an angle or a diagonal. That kind of plane or division is called oblique. I've just picked one diagonal plane on the leg of the torso. You really could put it anywhere just as long as it's running oblique. You have a set of muscles called the external obliques on your abdominal cavity, and they are running at an angle. So oblique means at an angle or a diagonal. So using your pink pencil, if you would write oblique in pink or highlight it pink and put your arrow on your man so you'll remember what an oblique plane is. Now, once we divide or open up a body, we can see that inside the body there are cavities. There are two types of cavities that you see in your body, closed cavities and open cavities. We're going to look at closed cavities first. This picture that you're seeing on the screen has some yellow closed cavities. They're towards the bony back, so they're called dorsal cavities. And then you see the red ones that are towards the belly, so those are called ventral cavities. There are two dorsal cavities, one that houses the brain, that's called the cranial cavity, and one that houses the spinal cord, called the vertebral or spinal cavity. Taking your yellow pencil, if you would highlight the word dorsal in yellow and color both of your dorsal cavities yellow, labeling the top one that houses the brain cranial and the one that houses the spinal cord vertebral. Now let's move on to the ventral cavities. There are more ventral cavities than dorsal cavities. We have superior ventral cavities and inferior ventral cavities, and they are divided by a muscle called the diaphragm. So on your sheet where you see the diaphragm, between the upper and lower ventral cavities, label it diaphragm, and we're going to color it green. Above the diaphragm, the superior ventral cavity is the thoracic cavity or the chest cavity. It houses the lungs, the heart, and the esophagus. We're going to color it striped red so that we can do each one of the ventral cavities a different color pattern. So take your red crayon or colored pencil and do the thoracic color striped red. Below the diaphragm, we have two cavities, the abdominal and the pelvic. I want you to use your red colored pencil and make a dotted red color pattern in the abdominal cavity, and then in the pelvic cavity just put a great big red triangle so that the red triangular region is going to be the pelvic cavity, the red dotted region is the abdominal cavity, and the striped red is the thoracic cavity. All of these red cavities are ventral cavities. So we have dorsal and ventral cavities. Now let's go back and look at that thoracic cavity from a frontal view. When we look at a frontal view of the thoracic cavity, we can see that it's actually divided into three cavities. The two blue arrows are pointing to the pleural cavities that house the lung, while the green arrow is pointing to the pericardial cavity that houses the heart. So do you see on your sheet where it says thoracic cavity, and it says A, B, and C under it. The A cavity we're going to say is pericardial, and the B cavity we're going to say is pleural. So you could color the pericardial word green and put a green arrow going to the picture that's on your worksheet. And then you can draw a blue arrow to the two pleural cavities, and on your B where you wrote pleural, kind of color over it blue. Now, there isn't another cavity, but there is a region in the middle of the thoracic cavity that's called the mediastinum, or the middle of the chest cavity. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a box, a yellow pencil, and we're just going to kind of draw that area. That area in the middle of the chest cavity is called the mediastinum or mediastinal space. And so for C, if you would write mediastinum and just draw an arrow going to that and kind of give yourself a yellow box, that will label that area, not really a cavity, in the middle of the chest cavity. That's going to end this part, and we're going to have another Screen-O-Matic viewing of the last part of this worksheet.